Good evening and welcome to the Ann Arbor District Library on AADL TV. Thanks for tuning in for tonight's presentation of Exploring the Mind with the University of Michigan Department of Psychology. In just a moment, Christopher Monk will introduce our guest, Dr. Adriene Beltz. To find past Exploring the Mind programs or view other virtual events, visit aadl.tv.
All right, thank you for joining us. Today, I'm very pleased to have Dr. Adriene Beltz talk to us about her research. Dr. Beltz is an assistant professor of psychology at the University of Michigan. She completed her undergraduate degree in psychology and theology from St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia. She went on to get her Ph.D. in psychology from Penn State University. Following graduate school, she continued on at Penn State as a postdoctoral fellow and then joined us here at Michigan in 2016. Dr. Beltz uses cutting-edge analytical techniques to understand how the brain mediates sex hormone influences on gendered behavior across the lifespan. She is the recipient of many stellar awards. Within the last few years alone, she received the Ann Anastasi Distinguished Early Career Contributions Award from the American Psychological Association, the Wilbert McKeechee Award for Excellence in Lecture-Based Teaching from the University of Michigan, the Jacobs Foundation Early Career Research Fellowship, and the Association for Psychological Science Rising Star Award. Dr. Beltz's talk is titled, From Average Differences to Different from Average, When Gender Matters for Emotion and Anxiety. Here is Dr. Adriene Beltz.
Thank you, Dr. Monk, for that kind introduction, and thanks to the Ann Arbor District Libraries for the fun opportunity to talk about my work today. I'm going to talk about averages, when they're good, maybe when they're not so good, and what that means for gender or for how we think about gender. So let me start with a rhetorical question. Do statistics describe you? We see statistics in the news, on our phones, as part of the news. We see statistics coming back from our kids' schools, and as we think about the pandemic and what different numbers mean. But how do we interpret what those numbers mean for us as individuals? I don't know about you, but I look at statistics and I say, okay, this is going on here, this is going on there, and I try to somehow decompose them to make sense, to make at least a reasonable plan for something going forward. Well, we can think of gender in a similar way because there's so many statistics surrounding it, aren't there? Let me give you an example, especially in the context of gender and emotion. For instance, 1 in 8 women experience depression in their lifetime, and that's twice the rate of men. Well, that's a pretty striking number, but how do I know if I'm that one woman, or what if I'm a man, and what if I also have depression? Does this statistic hide me? How about these numbers from Canada? Before the COVID-19 pandemic, about 3% of the population was estimated to have clinical levels of generalized anxiety disorder. But now, during the pandemic, about 17% of women and 10% of men had clinical levels of generalized anxiety disorder. So that's a pretty stark increase, and a starker increase for women than for men. But what does that mean for me if I have maybe some generalized anxiety symptoms? Here's another set of averages. Women tend to be better on average than men at different types of emotions, particularly emotional empathy. Men, on the other hand, tend to be better on average in self-confidence. So how do I know if my levels of emotional empathy are in line with what the average woman has? And because I identify as a woman, does that automatically mean that I have self-confidence lower than the average man? So there's a lot to think about with these statistics. They're no doubt meaningful. They give us a quick kind of snapshot of important information that we might need to act, but if we need to act on our own unique situation, they might not describe us so well. Let me develop that idea a little bit more, right? Let me explain why averages may not describe you, may not describe me. So in statistics, we often describe information in terms of these distributions. You see here the red distribution, a shape of the curve for women, and the blue distribution, a shape of the curve for men. On the x-axis, we have anxiety symptoms, and on the y-axis, we have number of people. So basically what we do is we just take each person, we take their anxiety symptom score, and we plot it on these distributions. So much so that we end up with this red distribution for women, this blue distribution for men. And this distribution holds a lot of important information. For instance, right here in the middle of it, because it's a normal distribution, we would see what would be the average score for women. That's a very quick single number that describes what's going on with anxiety for women. And slightly below that, in the middle of that blue distribution, we see the average score for men. And so based on this, we can take a quick snapshot, like I said, of this information, be like, wow, women on average are having more anxiety symptoms than men. But back to my question about earlier, what does that mean about me as an individual? Because if these blue dots here are representing individual scores for men, we see that a whole bunch of men are scoring above the average for women, even though women on average have higher scores than men. And we see a whole bunch of women, if they're the red dots here, have average anxiety scores that are lower, or have their own anxiety scores that are lower than the average for men. So while these distributions are useful, they make clear the point that averages may not describe individuals well. Averages may not describe individuals well. But I don't want to sour you to averages too much, because that doesn't mean averages aren't useful pieces of information. Especially when we think about gender, averages can help us understand and detect disparities. For instance, I just pulled an article, and you can Google and find tons of similar things on, say, gender bias in medical treatment. When men come into a clinic and say they're experiencing high levels of pain, for instance, there is a bias to say, oh, he must be very tough or very brave to be handling those high levels of pain. And on average, men are more likely to be prescribed medical interventions for high levels of pain. And then a woman walks into that same clinic and says, oh, she's also experiencing high levels of pain, and there's a bias to interpret that pain as more emotional, or maybe she's being sensitive. And then on average, women are prescribed maybe less medication, or more likely to have their pain attributed to psychological or other conditions. And that's not to say a physical or a psychological attribution for pain is good or bad in its own right. The issue is it depends on the person. And if on average, women's pain is being viewed one way and men's pain is being viewed another way, that could be revealing a very important bias. And so therefore, averages could help us detect these disparities and hopefully give us motivation to act on them to reduce them. The flip side of the coin is sometimes averages can actually help us dismantle stereotypes, right? If we have this bias that men are reporting pain in a certain way and women are reporting pain in a certain way, well, we can study that and say, hey, actually, when you look at the numbers, when you look at the data, the averages show pain in men and women is similar. Or in this case, I'm actually showing a headline of one of my studies that I'll tell you more about later, showing that on average, men and women didn't differ in their emotional ups and downs. So we need to get rid of that stereotype, right? So sometimes averages can reveal disparities, and sometimes they can help us debunk stereotypes. So this leaves us with a bit of a paradox. And that's what we're going to explore in our community talk today. When are averages good with respect to gender and emotions and anxieties? When do they tell us things we would really like to know and maybe encourage us to make positive change? And maybe when are averages a little bit more misleading, not describing individuals well, right? So today, I hope to showcase to you the good and the bad of averages for understanding the emotions, the anxiety of men and women. And what I am really excited about sharing is how we can go beyond averages to understand individuals. To understand individuals who are unique and diverse and who are actually the units making decisions about emotion, about anxiety, about acting in the world. So scientifically, how do we do this? How do we study averages versus individuals? And to try to illustrate this point, I'll show you what we call the data box, a classic data box. Do you notice here on the x-axis, we have variables. These are things we have measured for each person, where each person is on the y-axis. And so those variables are things like depression scores, anxiety, different aspects of emotion, and individuals' self-identified gender. And in most research is cross-sectional, right? So it basically takes like the front slice of this data box and focuses on all of those variables I just mentioned across a whole bunch of people going up that y-axis there, but only from a single measurement occasion. Do you see when we have a data set like this? This is what we call inter-individual variation, because the variation that we could possibly explain in this slice of the data box is variation across people. That's all we have, how people differ across variables. But there's another axis to this data box, the z-axis, right? Where that's labeled as measurement occasions going back. So we could study all of the same variables, right? If we take a top slice of this data box, we could study all of the same variables across all of those time points. I'm talking many, many, many time points, 50, 100, hundreds of time points, where we're measuring depression and anxiety and different aspects of emotion in just a single person. In just a single person. Now, the variation that we have to explain is called intra-individual variation, or variation within one person. The variation that a person shows, how they go up and down from their own scores over time. And so a lot of our research is focused on averages or inter-individual variation, because we can bring folks into a lab or send them a survey a single time. And that's good. But with advances in technology, we can, I don't know, get people to do surveys every day on their smartphone, or log onto their computer regularly, or track them with a Fitbit or smartwatch, and get a lot of information from the same person over many, many, many time points. Those types of data are called intensive longitudinal. They're not just like traditional longitudinal, where you follow folks every couple months or years, which is great work, but these are just different questions. They're about intensive assessments across people. And I mentioned several examples of this already, but consider physiological assessments as examples of intensive longitudinal data. I said the Fitbit or the smartwatch giving you your heart rate every day, or telling you many, many days what your restlessness was during sleep, or how long you slept. Functional magnetic resonance imaging, when we look at brain activity in an MRI scanner, for instance, you're actually having pictures of the activity of your brain every 1.5 to 2 to 3 seconds. So then you have picture after picture after picture after picture of what's going on in your brain. That's intensive longitudinal data. Whenever we have behavior recorded, right, videotaped or somehow recorded, or voice recordings, we can always break that down to code different observations. How much were certain words said over a period of time? How much positive affect did some girls show when they were playing together over a certain period of time? We can code that over and over and over again. And lastly, something like daily surveys. Daily diary studies. Every night before folks go to bed, we could say, hey, what emotions did you feel today? How much did you sleep today? What were your anxiety symptoms today? And if these folks graciously participate in the studies for many, many, many days, we can get a picture of what's going on with them emotionally over that period of time, intensively and longitudinally. And so that's what I want to tell you about today. That's how we're going to get at the good and the bad of averages, and how averages may or may not describe individuals. I'm going to tell you about a 75-day intensive longitudinal study that was conducted in my lab. And from that study, I'm going to give you examples of 3 different research questions that we investigated. And for each of those research questions, we'll kind of home in and say, okay, was this a good use of averages, or maybe not such a good use of averages? Or what I hope to impart is, wow, studying individuals is really interesting and important. So in our 75-day study, folks came into our lab one time and they completed a full assessment of different types of emotion measures and cognitive tests. And then every day for the next 75 days, they went and on their smartphone or any internet-enabled device, a tablet, a computer, they answered questions about their feelings, their experiences, their cognitive skills, how masculine or feminine they felt those days. And they did that for up to 75 days. And what I'm going to focus on here, this was a large study of almost 150 people, but I'm going to focus on in these three examples, 30 men and 28 women who are naturally cycling. Naturally cycling meaning they had a regular menstrual cycle, because that was important for some of our questions, as you'll see coming up. The sample was 70% white and generally young adults, on average 22 years old. And so the sample is not very representative. And also want to note that all of the men and the women in the study were cisgender, had cisgender identities. But we're really excited about the prospect of this individualized approach for helping us understand eventually and motivate the study of more diverse individuals. And I'll return to that point at the end as well. And our participants were really fabulous. I'd always be happy to talk more about the nitty-gritty methods of how we do this, but of these 30 men and 28 women, their response rate over those 75 days was 94%. So they provided data almost every day. All right, let's get into it. Let's ask our first research question from this intensive longitudinal study to help us understand what's going on with averages or not. And our first study was, do men and women, on average, differ in their daily emotion fluctuations? So this study, kind of the premise for this study was motivated by some research questions saying that, well, women, and this is the naturally cycling piece I wanted to return to earlier, that because women have a menstrual cycle with hormone levels that are kind of rising up and down across months or across a month, that these varying hormone fluctuations sometimes leads to variations in other aspects of their psychology, including their emotion, that make women, well, not so good as research participants, right? Those emotion variations linked to hormone variations are a confound in studies. And for that reason, women have actually been excluded as research participants for many decades, and to their detriment, because we've ended up with a scientific corpus of knowledge that mainly reflects men. And so our goal here was to use our intensive longitudinal data to actually study these fluctuations across a couple months and figure out whether men and women actually do differ on average. So to introduce this concept, I'll show you what is called the circumplex model of emotion. You notice there's a y-axis going up and down, how emotions can kind of be rated according to their levels of arousal or how engaging or activating there are. Like something like being very alert or being angry would be high arousal, but being calm or fatigued would be low arousal. But what we focused on in this study was instead that valence axis, which is going left to right, where we had a bunch of emotions that participants responded to every day in our study that were deemed to be positive. They had a positive valence. How prideful did you feel today? How enthusiastic were you today? How interested? And every day participants rated these emotions, these positive emotions, on a 1 to 5 scale, not so much today or extremely today. They also had a set of negative emotions. How irritable were you today? How afraid? Did you feel hostile? How much? And again, every day they rated these emotions on a 1 to 5 scale. And so then we averaged across all these positive emotions each day and across all of these negative emotions. And then we figured out how much those positive and negative averages went up and down across the 75 days. In other words, we examined the gender differences in intra-individual variation within a person. Intra, remember, that means within a person. How much did their emotion go up and down? How much did it vary day to day across these 75 days? Were there gender differences in that? And so the way we studied intra-individual variation in emotion was by using intra individual standard deviations. We called this emotional volatility following some other work. But basically, the premise is just how much do you differ from your own average across 75 days? Here's an example person for positive affect on the left to give you a sense of what low volatility is. So in this blue line here, and notice breaks in the line means those are days that we didn't have data from that person. They maybe didn't complete their survey that day. Notice here their intra-individual standard deviation was pretty low. They ranged from a little below 2 to a little above 3 in their positive affect almost every day. Whereas the person on the right, the green line there, notice there's no breaks in that line. That person didn't miss any days of their study. They had high volatility. Their scores went all, across the 75 days ranged almost from all the way down at 1 to all the way up at 5. And you can see the ups and downs. You can imagine what they must have been going through every day to experience these highs and lows in positive affect. We also looked at other ways that you could describe how much variation there is across these days and emotions. We called those things emotional inertia, emotional cyclicity, trying to get at whether there's any systematic patterns across people or across days, I should say. And so we calculated these metrics for everybody. And then across men and then across women, we plotted them to see if they differed. So notice here, this is the volatility measure, the one I just showed you on the previous slide for men in blue and naturally cycling NC women in red. And notice those thick black bars there at about 0.5 for men. About 0.5 for positive affect and a little bit below 0.5 for negative affect. For both the group of men and the group of women, their averages are about the same, aren't they? You have to squint really hard to see if there's any wiggle room, if there's any difference there between the averages of the blue and the red dots. And the same is true for the other emotion measures of inertia and cyclicity. The men's and women's averages are quite similar. And so from this, we concluded, yes, on average, men and women have strikingly similar indices of emotion variation. No matter how you look or try to kind of calculate some statistic to represent how up and down men and women are going, on average, women aren't doing that more than men and men aren't doing that more than women. And so what does this tell us about averages, thinking back to our kind of original purpose of this talk? Well, maybe this is helping us dismantle stereotypes, because this notion that the menstrual cycle, which is the image shown here, that the menstrual cycle leads to fluctuations that go up and down, women's emotions going up and down more than men's emotions go up and down. Well, that doesn't really hold. Men's and women's emotions are going up and down the same. In my lab, we like to say men and women are on the same emotional roller coaster, maybe for different reasons, but they're on the same emotional roller coaster. So because we had these intensive longitudinal data, we could study these variations over time, but then we used averages of those variations across men and women to say that, hey, they're not so different after all. We need to put this stereotype of emotion instability to rest. How about another example? How about another example from this same data set? You hopefully caught on when I said earlier that we averaged across all positive emotions and all negative emotions. But is it true that positive and negative, or even these valence and activation or arousal dimensions, are really the best way to describe people's emotions? Take, for instance, nervousness. That's actually considered to have a negative valence in the averaging that we did earlier, but sometimes being nervous is good. I'm nervous in giving this talk right now, but I'm also excited to share my work with you. And so maybe nervous isn't unidimensionally negative or bad. Similarly, calm. We tend to think of that as being restful and being at peace, and that's good. It has a positive valence. But sometimes being calm, well, maybe isn't the best response in a situation. If you're in a situation that requires action, or there's something that maybe should make you mad and encourage you to act, being calm in that situation might not be such a good thing. So our question here was, are there better ways to kind of group emotions than positive and negative? And more importantly, well, do individuals, do people's emotions kind of group together in different ways? And if they do, does that matter for things like anxiety? That was the research question we were investigating here. And so to do that, we used this analytic technique called person-specific factor analysis, where for each person, we figured out which of their emotions kind of grouped together statistically. And I'm going to show you an example of that. Here's one person. This is just illustrative results for one person. And you'll notice they didn't have two dimensions of emotion, say positive and negative, like we coded them in our last study. They actually had 7 factors or dimensions of emotion. And you can see here that the boxes to the right or left of those oval factors are showing which emotions group together. My favorite one for this person is factor 2, called the competition factor. Makes me think of the Olympics, right? For this person, on days they were nervous and distressed, things we would think to be kind of negative, they also experienced a lot of pride and determination, right? Or maybe it's not a competition, maybe it is like a motivation factor. You're nervous to do something, but you do it anyway, and you're proud of yourself for that. That is a dimension of emotion that was unique to this person. And we were able to create these types of emotion dimensions for all of the almost 60 people, men and women in our study. And when we did that, we saw that indeed participants actually didn't have very nice positive and negative emotion clusters. They had emotion dimensions or factors or clusters that were much more nuanced and much more diverse. This is the number of emotion dimensions each person in our sample had. You'll notice that most of them had 5. Some of them had 7, like we just looked at, and a couple people had 2. But even the people who had 2 didn't have dimensions that mapped directly on to positive and negative. They were a little bit more different than that. And so even at this, I'd say, interim portion of this study, we were able to say very definitively that averages actually don't describe individuals. Positive and negative is not the best way to describe the emotions of a given person. Maybe people on average that has some meaning for thinking about what emotions look like and how they're experienced generally. But when you focus on just one person and what they actually felt across 75 days, you get patterns of emotions that were much more complex. But then the next question was, okay, great, emotions are complex. And on average, how complex they were didn't differ between men and women. But did they differ for things like anxiety and other aspects of mental health? Well, it turns out that they did, on average, matter for anxiety. Let me show you this chart here. So again, men are in blue and women are in red. The individual squares are plots of individual people in our study, and those dashed red and blue lines are showing you the average trends across men and women. And what you can see here is that on average, as women have more emotion dimensions, right? More sets of emotions kind of clustered together in diverse and granular ways, that's actually associated with more anxiety. You see that line is sloping up with anxiety on the y-axis there. But for men, the more granularity there is to their emotion, the more dimensions they have, actually their levels of anxiety goes down. And so even though the kind of interim results of this study said, averages don't describe individuals, from this plot where we're looking across now men and women on average, we're actually seeing maybe some disparities in that the way emotions map onto anxiety differs for men and women. And that gives us some ideas of things we should follow up on to make sure that people are having, well, the best mental health possible. For instance, if thinking about the details of an emotion is maybe leading women on average to overthink those emotions and creating feelings of anxiety, then maybe a different approach is needed than for men when having lower level of emotion, maybe not thinking about that emotion enough and what it means is leading to anxiety. So in this example, there was some good and bad of averages, I guess. And now for the third example, and this one's my favorite. Here we asked whether the association, this is an established association in the literature, about what I'll call congruent gender expression and adjustment. Adjustment meaning things like anxiety and emotion or depression. Does this apply to all individuals in their day-to-day lives? Let me explain what that means a little bit more. I know this graph might not clarify it a whole lot, but here, let me pinpoint a few things. So if you look up top there, you see that's an identity cluster. So for men, individuals who identified as men and they, on days they feel, or in general, if they identify as men and they feel more masculine, that would be a gender congruent expression where feeling masculine aligns with an individual's identity of identifying as a man, or feeling feminine aligns with an individual's identity of experiencing themselves as a woman. And so on average, and this was at a single time point, this is just one of those cross-sectional studies about inter-individual variation. On average, men who report a greater masculine identity also report better adjustment, more positive affect, more self-esteem, less negative emotion. And the same was true for women. For individuals who identified as women, if they also reported perceiving themselves to be more feminine, then they experienced, on average, more positive emotions, more self-esteem, and less negative emotions. But from this, that's just describing how maybe men and women are on average. It doesn't mean that's how every man and woman is in both their identity and how they go about their day in masculine or feminine ways. And so our goal for this study was actually to look at this same relationship, but across days. On days people feel more masculine, are they more likely to be more anxious? On days they feel more feminine, are they less likely to be anxious? Does that go up and down for a person across days? Does this inter-individual difference apply within individuals too? So to look at that, we asked folks every day as part of our 75-day study questions like, how masculine did you act or appear today? Tell us on a 5-point scale. Not very much or extremely, from not very much to extremely. Other questions like, how feminine was your personality today? Or just in general, how feminine do you think you were today? How feminine did you come across to other people? In these cases, we didn't define what masculine and feminine meant. So whatever it meant to a person, that's how they responded. It's called self-perceived masculinity or self-perceived femininity. Whatever you think of as masculine or feminine, how much of that were you today? And let me show you this crazy plot. So again, on the x-axis, we have our days of our study from 1 to 75. And on the y-axis, we have this feminine to masculine score, where the feminine score, so feeling completely feminine on a given day would be a score of 1 there at the bottom. Feeling completely masculine on a given day would be a score of 5 there at the top. And if you didn't really feel masculine or feminine, there would be a score of 3 there in the middle. And the thin lines here, the thin red lines, show individual women and their scores across days, and the thin blue lines show individual men and their scores across days. And then the thick dashed blue line and the thick dashed red line show averages, the average across days for men and the average across days for women. And so just looking at this example, you can say, wow, those averages do not describe individuals well, do they? You can just try to follow some of the red lines or try to follow some of the blue lines, and you'll see people, their masculinity and femininity is fluctuating day to day. Now, we're not seeing huge shifts, scores going from 1 to 4 to 2 to 5, up and down across the whole range. For the most part, men are showing scores that fluctuate between like 3 and 5, so neutral to more masculine, and women are showing scores that fluctuate between 1 and 3, so feminine to kind of more neutral. But absolutely between like 2 and 4, you're seeing on some days individual women reporting scores that go above the average for men. You can find a few red lines above that thick blue line average for men, and you can even find some thin blue lines that go down below the average for women. So averages don't describe individuals. But actually, if you average this variation across men and women using that intra-individual standard deviation I mentioned before, like up when we were talking about emotion variability. So in this case, how much does somebody's femininity and masculinity go up and down day to day? When you look at those scores for men and women, you actually find that on average, women show more fluctuations day to day than men. Is that a disparity, or maybe that's just a difference? Is it a disparity in how men are reporting their feelings of masculinity? Or is it just a difference showing that, well, maybe different situations require different things of women, and so they're feeling like they're more masculine in some cases than others? So finding that average difference is interesting, and it motivates a lot of our future work about how this, for instance, might relate to mental health or things like anxiety, which was actually the second part of this study. Right? Does daily masculinity or femininity to masculinity, that same scale we were just looking at, we found that it is indeed related to daily anxiety in gender congruent ways, but only for some people. So just like we had daily measures of masculinity and femininity, we asked these same folks kind of daily questions about their anxiety. Things like, I was a worrier today. How much is that true of you on a scale from 1 to 5? Or I often felt tense and jittery today. How much is that statement true of you on a scale from 1 to 5? And so then what we did is we just plotted side by side those masculinity, femininity scores from the previous slide and these anxiety scores for individual men and for individual women. And I'm showing you an example here of the plot for just one woman. And you can see this masculine to feminine expression that we were looking at on the previous slide. It's shown here in like dark gray, and the anxiety score is shown across these 75 days in purple. And again, if there's breaks in the lines, that's just because the participant maybe didn't respond to the survey that day. And this is just so striking to me that you can visually see, right, to the naked eye, that as you have kind of spikes or peaks or dips in that feminine to masculine score, you actually see anxiety kind of spike or dip with it in concert, in sync in many cases, showing that for this woman on days, look at this around day 12, on days she felt very anxious, she was also feeling quite masculine. And on other days, look at day like 26, when she had a dip in anxiety, she was feeling less masculine or more feminine that day. And so she has this positive relationship, just a simple correlation between masculinity of anxiety of 0.28, meaning on days she felt more masculine, her masculinity went up, her anxiety went up on those same days too. Now let's look at an example of one man. Again, we've got this feminine to masculine gender expression scores in dark gray. And look, his scores are very high, between 4 and 5 almost every day, feeling very masculine most of the time. And he actually doesn't feel very anxious, especially toward the middle of the study. His anxiety scores are almost bottoming out there on 1, not feeling quite very anxious at all. But on days he does have dips in his masculinity, look up here around day 68 or so, we see these dips in masculinity. We see with it rises in anxiety. There's an inverse relationship here. When he feels less masculine, he also is feeling more anxious. And so these data from these two individuals that I have picked out to make this point show that for some people, gender congruent expression, if I identify as a woman and on days I feel more feminine, I feel less anxious. That's good for my mental health, for my adjustment. And if I identify as a man on days I feel more masculine, my anxiety, my depression stay low on those days. But if I identify as a man and I'm feeling less masculine on some days, a little bit more feminine, for this illustrative man, indices of anxiety and depression kind of rose to meet those lowering levels of masculinity. And so we were able to do this for all of the people in our sample. And so then you're probably wondering how many men then showed this pattern, where dips in masculinity kind of co-occurred with increases in anxiety, about 46% of men. So less than the majority, but not a small amount either. And what about women? What about women? Well, this pattern was seen for about 35% of women. And the fun thing is about women is about 35% of women showed this pattern, whereas masculinity went up, anxiety went up. But about another third of the sample, for them, when masculinity went up, anxiety went down. Feeling more masculine was protective in some ways for their mental health. And then for the other third of women, or 33% of the sample, there really wasn't a relationship between masculinity and anxiety at all. Just gender expression wasn't linked to their adjustment. And so from these results, we can definitely then say that averages don't describe individuals. The relationship between what gender means to you, how you self-perceived, how you perceived your own masculinity and femininity in a given day, and what that means for your anxiety or for your depression, we found a similar pattern of results. Well, that depends on the person. We can't say that on average. But we did look at it on average, just to see what would happen. And when we did, we found out that on average, if you average across men, you actually do see a pattern of results like these that I've shown you here for this one illustrative man. And so if you didn't focus on individuals at all, you would conclude that yes, on average for men, they've got to feel more masculine to feel less anxious. That's what we found on average, but it actually, that average only applied to 46% of our sample. So we return to this paradox between what averages tell us and the experiences that individuals have. Yes, so how did we explore the mind today? Well, we just visited the paradox of averages. We saw that they can be good. They can empirically challenge gender stereotypes. Women's emotions don't go up and down day to day any more than men's emotions go up and down every day. We're all on the same emotional roller coaster, as I said. Averages can also be helpful. They revealed some gender disparities and things related to anxiety. We found out for women, having greater granularity of emotion kind of predisposed them to maybe having more anxiety symptoms. But for men, on average, feeling less masculine and a sense of masculinity was important for their mental health. And so now we have to figure out, okay, so what do those things mean? What does it mean if masculinity is linked to anxiety in men? How does that allow us to help people and understand anxiety and gender? That's where we're going next with our work. But we've also learned today that averages can be bad. They can misrepresent individuals, no doubt. We saw that those positive and negative emotions actually don't describe everybody well. In fact, most folks had a very nuanced emotional profile, sets of emotions who hang together, or that hang together like in that competition dimension that we looked at. And in the last example, we saw that despite significant average effects of masculinity and anxiety, those averages, which you could see reported in any study as a headline, actually described less than half, less than the majority of the men in our sample. And so in closing, I'll just return to the first rhetorical question I asked. Do statistics describe you? Maybe sometimes you're average and maybe sometimes you're not. I think that's the case for me. But I hope this talk also encourages you to think about individuals and to appreciate and to support future work like ours in intensive longitudinal data collection. If we're able to collect more of these intensive longitudinal data, then we can understand individuals. But if we only do scientifically big cross-sectional studies where we bring folks into the lab once or ask them questions about how they are in general, we'll get some meaningful information, but we're going to miss that information about how individuals change from day to day, that intra-individual variation, which is really the motivating spark of my work. And once we understand individuals better, once we get those daily ups and downs, we can understand gender and its rich diversity. We don't have to group into men and women. We can ask how an individual identifies and what their gender-linked experiences were on a given day and study each person as if they're a sample of size 1. And that's the goal that we're working toward in my group. So thank you a lot for your time. I just want to end by acknowledging here my lab over the years, of course, the Ann Arbor District Library for sponsoring this talk, Jacobs Foundation, who sponsors me, and you see an image there of Dr. Kate Foster, who was a graduate student here at the University of Michigan. We worked together on those emotion dimensionality studies, and she's now an assistant professor at the University of Washington. So thanks again for your time. Any questions or comments for me, here's my contact information.
Great, thank you so much, Adrienne. That was wonderful. All right, I'll just go ahead with a few questions that I had. Sure. One is, so you mentioned very briefly naturally cycling women.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could give us a definition, what's meant by that, and why it's important here.
Yeah, good question. So naturally cycling women would we defined as just women having a natural menstrual cycle. So these would be women who weren't using any type of hormonal contraceptives or had any kind of reproductive conditions that would, inhibit their natural menstrual cycle. And the reason that's important here is maybe you caught on at the very beginning of the study. I said, well, we have like another 100 people that we didn't include in the results that I showed you today. And actually all of those people were women using different forms of hormonal contraceptives. And we were really interested in trying to understand whether different hormonal milieux, women's different hormonal experiences are indeed related to their daily experiences of emotion and anxiety and even gender expression. We haven't gotten to that element of all of the work yet, but I can tell you, for instance, in the first study where we were looking at the emotion volatility, how much emotions go up and down, and I said that men and naturally cycling women didn't differ. Well, women using different forms of hormonal contraceptives, they didn't differ from naturally cycling women. So basically, there was some early, long-going kind of bias suggesting, like I said, that women's hormonal ups and downs potentially were influencing their emotional ups and downs more than for men. And we said, well, that's not true, not for naturally cycling women and not for women using different forms of hormonal contraceptives. So basically, I made the point about naturally cycling women just to emphasize that there's this kind of whole other area to the study, trying to figure out at how hormones may or may not be involved in some of these processes, but that wasn't part of the data I showed you here today.
Right, great. So that's something to look forward to in the future then, to find out.
I hope so.
Right. And just so like, does the medication vary based on estrogen and progesterone? Is that the basics of it, or are there other hormones?
Yeah. So the hormonal contraceptives that we've looked at in this study, They all have the same estrogen, synthetic estrogen called ethinyl estradiol, but the progestin, the synthetic progesterone in them actually differs in terms of its androgenicity. Some are anti-androgenic, some are highly androgenic, and some moderately. So actually, by looking at women using different particular types, in this case, it was all oral contraceptives. Of oral contraceptives, we actually have kind of a natural experiment for different types of hormones, not just estrogen and progesterone, but also androgen.
Oh, that's really cool. So that'll be great. Also great to hear about down the road. Very cool.
Yeah.
So just one other question related to that, like, and maybe this involves like speculating a bit or looking into the literature. So you found like really nice data showing that, you know, there are no gender differences in terms of emotion. More broadly, looking at hormones or gender or whatever, do you see, are there any kind of behavioral differences, like reliable behavioral differences out there?
Related to?
Either, sorry, I'm not framing this well. So, and I'm just saying broadly in terms of hormones that you see, cycling, or gender differences, I get that you see. I guess that you mentioned a few, but do you see other areas where you see differences in behavior?
Yeah, so we really focused on here those emotion fluctuations, the emotional ups and downs. But we do know, for instance, that hormones like estrogen, like progesterone, they do directly impact emotion. For some people more than others, and in some contexts more than others. So what we didn't look at was just at whether hormones, major emotions led to gender differences in positive affect or in negative affect. So did men and women differ in just mean levels of positive or negative affect? There's large literature on this, and basically it depends. It depends on the samples of men and women and the age groups and if hormones are considered or not. But what we looked at is really those patterns of emotional fluctuation. Think of it like the emotional fluctuations. I like to describe it as like a toddler, right? You don't know what you're going to get from one minute to the next. It's not whether toddlers on average have very positive or very negative emotion. It's kind of that volatility that you don't know what you're going to get from a toddler from minute to minute. So that volatility is what we focused on here, because presumably that's what folks were saying, that great variability going along with the menstrual cycle is what was leading women to be unpredictable, so to speak. But what we found is that men have similar volatility. It's not due to their ovarian hormones, obviously, but it's due to other things. Right? It can be sleep, it can be stress, it can be, workload, it can be interpersonal relationships. So basically, hormones are one part of what influence our emotions, but there's tons of things that influence both the emotions of men and women, so much so that those ups and downs end up not different. Yeah. On average.
Okay, great. Thanks. And then another question I had was, and I'm sure this is something that you guys have thought a lot about, I just wanted to give us a chance to talk about this a little bit, is how do you, so you're looking at gender differences, and in this one study finding that there are none. What did you equate for other aspects between the genders, and how did you, in terms of recruitment, how did you do that, and then try to look at any other differences and see if those would not account for your differences, any differences you might find later?
Yeah. In this study, so basically asking, are there things we controlled for, what could be leading to these emotion ups and downs? This type of study, this intensive longitudinal study, we're taking a different approach than the typical kind of experimental approach. Our goal is not necessarily to kind of control for or say the differences aren't due to this and they're not due to that, they're not due to that. Instead, we're saying, let us understand in your real world, everyday life, you telling us about your emotions on your smartphone. Let us understand how the emotions actually are. Because that's how we live, right? The kind of the output of your emotion day to day, wherever they're from. And then we study that, and we study that for gender differences in this case. So whatever is related to gender could be related to those differences. So we talked about hormones, we talked about stress, we talked about work, relationships, cultural norms, expectations for how we're supposed to act or how we're supposed to report about our emotions. All of those things could be involved. The goal here was instead to say, okay, given all of those influences, do we end up at different spots? Do individuals end up at different spots? And well, none that we can find according to gender in this case. So this type of study is different. There's presumably, potentially more noise in it because it's not about isolating a given influence. It's about kind of understanding a system of behavior as it actually occurs.
Okay. And that's great. And the last question I had is not I don't want to put too fine a point on it, but I would imagine like from the outset, what people would ask you is, so what are the gender differences? And I'm realizing as we talk, as you give your talk, it's really that may not be the right question. And we really need to factor in, like there's a range of differences in gender. It's much more complex than we may have previously realized or acknowledged. Is that fair? Maybe you could just explain that a little bit more. And I think you're getting that at the end of your talk.
Yeah, that really is kind of the perspective here, that gender can mark something meaningful on average, right? It marks some combination of our biology, our social experiences, our cultural expectations, the context we're in, right? Some of these things do systematically differ between men and women. And so when we see gender differences, it says, okay, there's something going on in one of those elements that we need to address, right? Maybe it's a disparity, maybe there's a cultural disparity, or maybe the expectations are systematically different and unfair. Right. So sometimes gender differences can be very useful on average in detecting some of those underlying influences. But that doesn't mean an average gender difference describes every man and every woman. Right. Sometimes means describe us well. Right. Sometimes you can put 3 people in a room and 3 people with anxiety in a room, and 2 are women and 1 is a man, and that aligns exactly with what the statistics would prescribe, and sometimes not, right? So I think the story is complex, and the point I'm trying to make is that gender differences can be useful for dismantling stereotypes, right, and for detecting disparities, but that doesn't mean every man and every woman is described by those averages. We're all actually kind of complex mixes of things that are more expected or more gender typical or more gender atypical for how we behave and how we think and the things that we like. And that's really what I think the value of an individual approach is, because then it also, as I said, helps us get away from averages and understand individuals, because right, a label of man or woman doesn't describe all of us. So how do we understand the complex meaning that gender has to different people, to different points in their lives or in different situations? Well, we certainly can't put an average on that. So sometimes good, sometimes bad.
That's great. Okay, very helpful. All right, wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Beltz. This has been really informative, very valuable. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It was a lot of fun.